and welcome everyone to tonight's Core Volunteer Training lesson. We're in week 10 of our 12-week progression, and for those that have made it through the whole thing or just tuning in for the first time tonight, we're so glad that you're giving your evening on this very important topic of communicating across the aisle with both conservatives and liberals. On tonight's lineup, we're lucky enough to have two of CCL's foremost staffers to be on the call with us. First up, we'll have Jim Tolbert. Jim has been volunteering for CCL for many years now and is serving as lead for CCL's outreach to conservatives, and is also responsible for growing our conservative volunteer base, helping volunteers work with conservative audiences and guiding the activities of our conservative caucus. And then following Jim's presentation, we'll have Stephanie Doyle. Stephanie Doyle is a CCL original, working her way up from an intern out in California now all the way through senior outreach liaison in Washington, D.C., where she's responsible for formulating and strengthening relationships and engagement with other non-governmental organizations within the energy and climate field. And she's also working on finishing up her Master's of Science at Johns Hopkins in energy policy and climate. So thank you so much for both being on the line tonight, Jim and Stephanie. And just as we always do, a quick highlight of the learning goals for this evening, so you know what we're really trying to target and what you'll be able to walk away with, hopefully. An understanding of the foundational difference in values between conservatives and progressives, as well as the chance to really learn how to engage both sides of the aisle in deeper respect-based listening. And then lastly, we'll have that activity again where we can really practice demonstrating how to have productive conversations with people from both sides of the aisle using the tools we review tonight. And so with that, I'm going to actually just go over the agenda real quick on the actual kind of moral foundations theory, followed by understanding the conservative view and the progressive view. Each of those will take the first 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A, followed by a productive exercise of how to have more engaged conversations, and then we'll bring it back for more discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jim, and we'll have the chance to jump right in.
Great. Thanks for the introduction. What does it mean to speak to somebody with a different political persuasion than you? And to structure that, we're going to use as a basis in some of this discussion some work by Jonathan Haidt, who's worked on what he calls moral foundation theory, which is a big kind of complex set of three words. But the main thing is it's an ideas about how morals. And morals are simply us evaluating what is and what is not acceptable. That's all that morals are, is us putting things in categories of what is and what is not acceptable. And we do it all the time as people. Jonathan Haidt has looked across the country as well as across the world at different societies and tried to evaluate, are there some common themes and common dimensions that I can break out in how people evaluate what is and what is not acceptable. And he's come up with 5 and then added a 6th dimension onto how people struggle with that question, what is and what is not acceptable. And really quickly, they're the 5 main ones on the screen here. Harm versus care. We're just not allowed to harm people. Is it fair? Is another question. Am I being loyal to my group? Is a third way that we evaluate. Is it okay for me to do something? Is it all right? What is and what is not acceptable? Does it respect authority? Is another way that we evaluate what is and what is not acceptable. And is it consistent with things that I view as pure and sacred? Does it line up with my views on purity and sanctity? So an interesting dimension, the reason we end up bringing Jonathan Haidt's work in here is because he also has started asking people questions about how they self-identify politically, and started to pick apart how people that self-identify differently politically value the first 5 we're going to talk about mostly differently. And came up with some interesting observations that I have found really relevant in helping people understand how to speak to people with political persuasions that are different than them in both directions. So the graph on the right side of this shows these 5 values: the harm, fairness, in-group loyalty, authority, and purity. And then on the bottom scale here, it shows strongly liberal on the left to strongly conservative on the right. And the up and down axis shows how strongly somebody thinks, how relevant these values are to them. So what we find on the strongly liberal side is that harming people, whether or not you harm people and whether or not it's fair, really drives morality, really drives people's evaluations of whether or not it's acceptable to do something. And as you shift over to the conservative side, people that identify as more conservative end up blending in three other ideas or dimensions when they're evaluating, is it or is it not acceptable to do something? And those are in-group loyalty, authority, and purity. And I want to just walk through each of those separately to say what is it and how does it relate to climate change? How does this tie into the discussions we're having? So the first one I just want to talk about is in-group loyalty. If you don't value in-group loyalty, sometimes it can actually feel like, no, that's just not a good thing. I look at when people are really loyal to their group, and I think they often make really dumb decisions. And you can probably point out a few examples of that. But I'd really like to stress that all of us use in-group loyalty at some level. So I would ask if somebody walked into your room behind you, you're mostly sitting at home or somewhere, and somebody in your family stuck their head in the door and said, "Hey, we just heard that somebody got arrested for tackling their neighbor in Kentucky and breaking 5 of his ribs, and this person's in jail." You probably wouldn't want to run out of the room and say, "Well, I need to make sure that person's all right that's in jail." If somebody walked into your room and said, "Hey, I just heard on the news somebody tackled their neighbor and they're in jail right now for tackling the neighbor and breaking 5 of their ribs, and they were from your hometown," you might go, "Oh, well, I wonder who it was." Or if they said, "Well, and it said they went to the high school you graduated from," you might start asking more questions, but you still probably wouldn't get up and leave the room. If they walked in and said the exact same thing, and said, it's your brother. They said the name and it's your brother, you would probably hang up right now and leave the room and leave this training session, because that is close enough inside your group that you have different evaluations of what is right and what is wrong to do when you hear things about somebody that's that close inside your group. And all of us have these groups. I would even suggest a different dimension here. If somebody had said, "Hey, you know what? Your dog is just got picked up by the kennel because he bit your neighbor," you'd probably hang up and leave, because your dog is in a certain group. If you have a dog, certain people I know would be off the phone really quickly. We all have these groups. People on the conservative side often value groups that they are closer to at a higher level. They bring that dimension in when they're figuring out what is and what is not acceptable. How does this play out in climate change? We often signal our groups very loudly and very clearly and very proudly. And we have in-group loyalties that we just oftentimes are not aware of. If we walk into a meeting with a slide deck from the Climate Reality Project and start giving that presentation, we may be really proud that we went through the climate reality training. And what we might be saying to somebody sitting in the audience is, this is somebody that really values Al Gore and thinks like a Democrat, and is probably somebody that's really outside my group. Similarly, if you walk in with a Make America Great hat, Make Great Again hat on, you're saying you're part of a different identity. And you may treat somebody differently that has the hat. On the right side of this, other ways we just signal our behavior is how we communicate on certain subject matter. So pipelines is a really interesting one to look at how people signal identity on how you think crude oil should be transported across the United States. We rely on cars. It's not that we're not going to use refined petroleum. So how does should the crude get transported across the United States? In trains, in trucks, or the top one, which is just an underground pipeline? That oftentimes there's a lot of communication around that, communication around pipelines that signals group identity as strongly to certain individuals as it signals the facts that you might think you're talking about. So I pointed out the in-group loyalty. We often signal groups to other people that we're not aware that we're signaling until we really step back and say, what underlying messages am I sending about group loyalty in the discussion I'm having? Another dimension is authority versus subversion. So as children, we really get this. We have parents and they're an authority, and you know what, we get how it stacks up. As adults, we sometimes start abstracting it and say, well, I really want to make all my own decisions for myself, especially in the United States. We have a tendency to think that my value judgment of wanting to make all my decisions for myself is the right way to do it, and that other societies are just wrong when some people in other societies, you know, want their parents to make decisions for them even when they're in their adult life. And I oftentimes on the conservative side, conservatives, on average, this is not as a totality, but on average, conservatives consider authority when they're evaluating what is and what is not acceptable, more than people on the liberal side or progressive side, liberal side in how Haidt phrases his dimensions. And just an example of how this plays out, there are some climate writers that really stress what we're trying to do is overthrow the current system. And the wording can come off, you know, let's not let the climate moment, let the climate moment offers an overarching narrative so that we can fight all of these other battles and get to a shock-proof economy, AKA just let's get rid of this capitalism, let's get rid of the structure we have right now, can sound very much like you're pushing back against all authority, or the writer is pushing back against all authority. And this kind of language has a very different subcontext to somebody that values authority versus subversion more than someone else. All right, one more I want to go through as an example of what Jonathan Haidt's talking about and how it relates to us. This is purity and sanctity versus degradation, and this is what really relates to what we hold as pure and sacred. And again, people that are conservative tend to use an evaluation of how they view things as pure and sacred when they're figuring out what is and what is not acceptable to do. So if you've had confusion on what's the big deal about somebody kneeling at the beginning of the national anthem, you might be on the edge that doesn't value purity and sanctity as much, or maybe doesn't understand how other people value purity and sanctity. Versus if you've talked to some people that get a little more upset about it, you might understand that some people really just hold certain things as pure and sacred. We see it in other cultures too. When you look at the outrage over you know, something as what we might view as simple as printing a cartoon about you know, a political cartoon that has the Prophet Muhammad in it, and there's death threats against the person because that's a pure and sacred thing you're not supposed to do. So the American flag is a great classic example that you know, many people hold as very pure and sacred and representing things. Next slide. That we can look at how we use it as a symbol in ways that we're trying to make a nice, cute point that we think is really valid, or that some people do. I wouldn't say we, but many people use flag symbolism in a way that is trying to make a point. Geez, America is just bought by corporations, and you know, here's this time bomb, and some of the American people holding it, the bomb to the world. And this type of symbol triggers an can easily trigger an emotion of disgust in people that hold the flag very sacred. And once you trigger someone's disgust emotion, you're having a much different conversation than you really thought you were going to with the person. And it's often impossible then to hold a meaningful conversation with the person because you've intentionally kicked their disgust button. So next slide shows an example of, you know, how can you then use the American flag to make a good point, to make a point that needs to get made, that we need to, you know, pay attention to science, address climate change. And here's, I think, some good examples of people that were trying to do this, of, you know, they're using the flag as a symbol in the way that people that hold the flag sacred would look at it and go, oh, these people get me, these people understand me, and these people are communicating in a way that I can understand it. So these are just some teaser, if you will, on how looking at how people with different values actually evaluate what's right and wrong differently. And this slide will be in the slides that you can go pull up, and all these are hot linked. These talks and interviews by Jonathan Haidt, but the piece I really want to point out is what a diverse set of interviewees and or groups of audiences that Jonathan Haidt is talking to here. So it's really interesting to listen to him talk to Krista Tippett and On Being, and then at the Cato Institute, talked to Bill Moyers, and then talked to Reason TV's Nick Gillespie, who's about as strong of a libertarian as you can get. So it's a really interesting suite of people. He also has the take his quizzes button. You can go in and take his quiz to figure out how you score on these moral dimensions, how his quiz would say he thinks you're evaluating what is right and what is wrong. What is acceptable and what is not acceptable behavior. So that's a quick summary on just on one way to start breaking down, looking at conservatives. If you think you have a hard time talking to them, getting a little bit more curious about how they view what is and what is not acceptable behavior, and even looking at the things you may do that may trigger some of their buttons. In how you're communicating climate change to them.
Thank you so much, Jim. And we'll pass it over to Steph for the second half of this first section before we open up to Q&A.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie. I work in the DC office, like Brett mentioned. And I was going to touch on Jonathan Haidt from the Progressives value set, but I think Jim did a really good job of sort of explaining it when he showed you the graph. But just to remind you as I go through this next part, was that just remembering that liberals tend to favor openness to new experiences. Liberals rate higher with that care and fairness as principles of morality, while, like Jim mentioned, conservatives tend to kind of blend all five of those together, which included loyalty and authority and sanctity. And overall, just remembering that progressives really form their morality around this idea of harm and fairness and that openness to new experiences kind of idea. So I'm going to go through 5 sort of tips, techniques for having discussions with progressives and liberals. These can be kind of applied to members of Congress as well as just the general public. And I encourage you, if you are interested in this, Carla Weiss is the head of the Progressive Action Team, and she actually came up with most of these talking points. I want to give her a lot of credit. So if you have more questions or want to dive deeper into that, joining that action team is a good place to do it. So the first sort of tip idea to remember is to making a connection. So this should be what you're doing every time you have a conversation about climate change, but it's just good to remember. Remember to ask people what their thoughts are and listen for points of agreement. If somebody mentions to you that they're outraged about the US pulling out of a climate accord, jump on that and explain, maybe there's a way to still fight for solutions here at home, and kind of pick up on maybe some of the anger or sadness they're feeling. And you can sort of talk about connections to how they can work back at home. Another example is that comes up a lot, I think, when you're having discussions with progressives or liberals, is when somebody doesn't see the connection between climate change and their issue. So you can point out, if you have this come up in a conversation, that working for better healthcare is extremely important, and climate is going to make health issues far worse for a lot of people, especially the most vulnerable, and that perhaps there's a way to talk about the need for both climate solutions and healthcare solutions together. It's important to not belittle another person's issue or topic, but it's a good place that you can find places of agreement and kind of work together to kind of link two issues together. The second is listening and responding to questions and objections. So always listen to people's objections to our policy, and work from a position of understanding and appreciation of the values that they're coming at it from. So a lot of progressives find it objectionable that everyone gets a fair share of the dividend. I've had multiple conversations like this where someone thinks that the lowest income people deserve a bigger dividend. And you can agree and point out that, you know, there's lots of other policies that need to be addressed to help low income people. But I feel like it helps to remind people that we're in a Republican controlled government, and the need for something that appeals to both sides right now is really important. And along with that, it's important to value and acknowledge where CCL sits in the bigger climate movement, and to acknowledge other environmental organizations that are out there working on climate and explain how CCL fits in this unique niche in the middle. And I find that helps people understand that reason that we advocate for the policy we do, because of our, desire to appeal to both sides. The third sort of tip I would bring up is share reasons for optimism. So this one is especially important when you're meeting with Democratic members of Congress. For those of you that haven't met with your member of Congress yet, and if they're a Democrat, one thing that you will notice when you talk with their staff, or the member themselves, is that a lot of times about climate, they can be kind of down. And so spreading optimism is a really good, important thing to remember. A lot of Democratic members are frustrated or jaded from years of working on the climate issue, and they don't see anything happening with Republicans. And so they're very unaware of anything good that's happening at all on the issue from the right side of the aisle, especially if they're coming from a progressive state where maybe they don't even interact that much with Republicans. It's really good to point out the Climate Solutions Caucus, the Republican Climate Resolution. A lot of members and staff surprisingly won't have heard of it. I think that's less so now, but for past years it has been. And it's important to highlight that we're having productive conversations with Republicans, and to ask them to continue to talk to their counterparts about climate change and solutions, and to help get over the cynicism that a lot of them feel. And this applies just as well when you're giving presentations to liberal or progressive audiences, especially when you're talking about the way we work. You'll often find yourself fighting the cynicism that's really present in our societies right now. And people want to hear good news. They want things that give them hope, and we can be that for them. It also helps to give people ways to engage, to encourage them to try to reach out to a conservative neighbor, and give them tips, like you just learned from Jim, on how that's possible. And just reminding them, again, of the great work of the caucus. A lot of times, just talking about all the great work and the progress that's been made on bipartisan climate work will make the reality of a bipartisan bill like ours seem way more likely. Fourth tip is to discuss the progressive impact of carbon fee and dividend. So for conservatives, a lot of times we like to focus on jobs, health benefits, but for those on the left of the spectrum, protecting low-income people who will be facing rising energy prices tends to be an important talking point. So it's really important to focus on that aspect of our policy with them and the progressivity of it. There's plenty of graphs in our REMI study, which is the economic study that we have on our policy, that shows the progressivity of it. One just example is that it shows that people low on the socioeconomic ladder have a smaller carbon footprint, which means they end up with more money from the dividend, which in itself creates a progressive policy. Language matters, and using trusted allies. I have some examples of just language that tends to work when you're having these conversations with liberals. Saying all households versus American households. This goes back to the Jonathan Haidt idea of thinking about how liberals tend to care about harming and caring and fairness. And liberals tend to care about undocumented workers, those that are disadvantaged, and all households tends to ring truer to that than American households. Using corrective to the market rather than market-based or market-friendly. A lot of progressives feel that conservative policies, especially market-based solutions, are what has led to much of the inequalities that we face in the larger economy. And so by talking about how a price on carbon corrects the market, we can exemplify how we're fixing the system rather than relying on it. The third one is the transformative power of a rising carbon fee. So Haidt, again, mentions this idea that progressives and liberals tend to be open to new experiences. So talking about how a carbon fee will change the market, it will change the economy, it will transform us towards a clean economy. Those words tend to resonate with liberals and progressives very well, because that's what they value. And then this idea of fairness, again, going back to Haidt, pollution should not be free, polluters should pay. That type of messaging plays on that fairness value. And then one other note to mention, this isn't on here, but just remembering not to bash the Clean Power Plan. A lot of other environmental organizations worked on it, and a lot are still working to defend it. And it doesn't do us any favors to go into, especially Democratic office, who maybe worked on it and supported it. It doesn't do you any favors to go in and talk about how it's not a good policy or it didn't do enough. It was what was possible at the time. And then on the next slide, just wanted to mention, actually it'll be 2 slides, but so using trusted messengers. So we talk about this a lot in regards to conservative messengers. Within CCL, a lot of our high profile messengers are conservative because they're needed in that space. But that doesn't appeal to a progressive or a liberal a lot of times. So it's important to remember that there are some really great progressive liberal messengers that you can use instead. So this page has some examples. The Pope, Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders have all supported price on carbon and a carbon tax, specifically not specifically our policy, but price on carbon, carbon tax you can talk about in those examples. Bernie Sanders has introduced carbon tax legislation in the past 3 Congresses. So there are some really good examples of messengers when you want to talk to somebody from the progressive side of the aisle. And then this is just another page showing more examples. These are all versions of a carbon tax that have been submitted by Democratic members in the House and the Senate. So there's some, you can point out that this is a progressive policy. There's, this has been submitted by Democrats. It should go along with progressive values. So those are my tips.
Sure. So if you are not members of Community, I really encourage you strongly to look at Community. There's some things you can get to without membership, but get your membership. Once you're there are a series of buttons across the top. There are 5 or 6 buttons that take action. If you're thinking of reaching out to a community like a group of progressives or a group of conservatives, if you click the take action, this menu system on the left will come up, and on outreach actions, community outreach, if you click that where it's down in the green box, it would take you to some menus that have both progressive outreach and conservative outreach. Is one area you can find more information. And on the next page, we go into looking for the action teams themselves. So under Connect, you can connect to different action teams. Under the Connect button, you'd have to pick action teams, and then it would come up with this page where you can connect with the Conservative Caucus if you're a conservative that wants to help out, be a trusted messenger reaching out to other conservatives, or the Conservative Caucus media team, or the Progressive Outreach team. So those are 2 great places that you can go on CCL's Community to get additional resources or to join some of the action teams formed around these topics. So I'm going to set up the exercise tonight, and let's just go right into the next slide. We're going to talk about having a productive conversation, and it's going to be focused on having a productive conversation with a conservative. And the fundamental piece that this idea that I'm going to present tonight is built on is it comes out of Difficult Conversations, which is from the Harvard Negotiation Project. Getting to Yes was their first book. This is a good 15, 20-year-old book, Difficult Conversation, that is a classic that I'd encourage people to read. The underlying concept that it presents is that we often have 3 different types of conversations, and we often don't know which one we're really having. A what happened conversation, a feelings conversation, and an identity conversation. A what happened conversation is the kind that we think we're having when we talk about climate change and is the easiest to have You know, is my lunch ready or not? Did I order this or didn't I? But oftentimes those start triggering feelings conversations. Well, I'm frustrated because my orders are late. And oftentimes at a deeper level, they can even start triggering conversations where I'm feeling insecure. Well, you know, maybe it's late because I just didn't communicate well and I'm just not really a good communicator. Identity issues can creep into conversation. So next slide. When we talk about climate change, we often think we're having a conversation about facts, a what happened conversation. And in reality, one of the people in the dialogue at least is probably getting nudged into an identity conversation or at least a feelings conversation. And it's important to understand that in any conversation on climate change, but especially if you're reaching out to somebody with a little different political identity than yourself. So next slide, the tip we're going to suggest tonight is that when you are having a conversation, so we're gonna focus it over and say having a conversation with a member of Congress as a case study here. That what we want you to do is to grab on to pieces where you can agree with the person and only start a dialogue around the components where you can agree with them. You might be agreeing with them to bring in another subject matter to expand his perspective, but look for areas where you can agree with somebody and use their wording back to them to show that you agree, to clearly say, I agree on this point, and carry the conversation forward. So we're going to set up a conversation here. We're going to pretend that we're in a meeting with a member of Congress. We have gone through and explained our policy. Somebody else in the group, we're in a group of 4 or 5 people, somebody's explained CF&D. The congressman had just happened to walk in while we were talking to the legislative assistant, and he's got 10, 15 minutes, and we've got this short period of time to influence his ideas. After the CCL persons explained CCL's policy, they ask him, so what do you think? And we're going to play a short clip that's going to be the member of Congress. What's the next thing you would say in that meeting? Just what is the very next thing you would say in that meeting? Building on the idea of anchoring your sentences, the next thing you would say on points of agreement with this member of Congress. So we're gonna play the video. Everybody's gonna get broken into these, and here's what his response is.
The fact that experience has
Brett's gonna
changed your
cue it
view
up
in
to
any
the
way.
right spot. Here we go.
Well, I certainly do not disagree with the fact that climate change happens, but I do think that it's reasonable to question very carefully the science that has used models which have sometimes come under fire for having been sort of fraudulently manipulated in order to produce a result. When we talk about spending the people's treasure and the very concept of that we can fix climate change with some sort of a tax is something that I certainly take, very seriously with regards to having intelligent debate about. In other words, I will not follow blindly into any endeavor that mandates the harvesting of the people's treasure. Climate change has existed well before human history. So the question is not whether or not our climate changes across the planet, nor is it really a question that the human race does have some sort of impact upon climate change. The question becomes to what degree and at what extent and what sort of time frame and how can we really best address that, and does it call for harvesting of the people's treasure?
I know Jim also highlighted the kind of common ground again, regardless of whether you contribute to humans fully or, a large part, the climate has always been changing, and really we're asking that same question of how much man has impacted it. Just after tonight, if you're interested, both Stephanie and Jim's contact information as well as mine are provided here, and the community outreach sections hyperlink has been in the chat window. It's also here in the slide deck. We would love to make sure to help connect any of you to these groups that are really helping prepare and train our volunteer base. I think one of the big things that both Stephanie and Jim continue to emphasize too is just being authentic. But I think for tonight, just given everyone's time, I really want to uplift and thank both Stephanie and Jim for their involvement. I want to thank everyone for being on the call. I'm going to unmute all lines so anyone else can share their thankfulness, and then we'll be happy to stay on the line for at least a little bit longer, and you're free to go about your evenings too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.